Hello, everyone. This is Zahra Hussain. I'm an architect and a human geographer based in Pakistan. I run the organization Large Birth, which has been working in the mountain areas of Pakistan for the last decade. Today, I'll be talking about a project which is called the Fragile Heritage Ecologies. And let me just share my screen now. Vernacular cultures and the at-risk landscapes of the Hindu-Kush-Himalaya mountain region. This is a project that is being run by Durham University and Large Birth. The principal investigator is Professor Mike Krang, based at the Geography Department, and myself, based at Large Birth. In this project, we are particularly interested in understanding how mountain communities are adapting to the impacts of climate change in their local environment, specifically with respect to their tangible and intangible heritages. So I'll tell you a little bit about the context of the areas that we're working in. The Hindu-Kush-Himalaya mountains contain the largest ice cap outside the polar regions. They stretch along the northern Pakistan and are home to unique societies in terms of culture, heritage, biodiversity, environment, and diverse terrain that are transforming with the changing climate. Climate change in mountain areas triggers natural disasters through increased flooding. The glaciers provide water for the entire country and serve as a lifeline. This conjunction means that Pakistan ranks 8th on the Global Climate Risk Index, but the alarming state is that the country is termed as 4th most vulnerable for climate change impacts. The areas selected for this project specifically focus on mountain communities settled in the Hindu-Kush-Himalaya mountain region that are important sites historically and culturally, and are dealing with the effects of climate change in the form of, changing land patterns, water patterns, and frequent destruction caused by flash floods and landslides. So the Fragile Heritage Ecologies project explores in what ways does the community conceptualize heritage in changing times, and how does their identity relate to their cultural landscape, which is also changing, and how are the various senses of loss experienced and articulated by local communities, and how do these relate to official heritage? And lastly, we are asking what mechanisms of preparedness and adaptation are being explored by local groups. And then the project kind of goes on to develop a fragile heritage framework, which I'll talk about more later in the presentation. So we're basically looking at heritage in the form of, both material and immaterial, and heritage in the form of making, rather than looking at it as a static entity. So while this region, the Hindu-Kush-Himalaya region, has been a focus of conservation efforts, but it mostly around natural heritage, or specifically the physical mountain environment and habitat. The nature-culture divide remains strong. That affects how heritage in mountain areas, which is entwined in the living patterns and practices of the people, is seen and understood by different stakeholders, such as the government and local mountain communities. The communities settled in the Hindu-Kush-Himalaya mountain region have a heritage of adapting to cultural and physical movement. Both natural and cultural landscapes are historically unstable and in motion. And these communities and their heritage has never been about status, but a dynamic response to the movements of people, ideas, and cultures that have passed through these valleys, as well as the shifts in landforms due to the physical nature of these mountain areas. With continual natural disasters over the last 200 years in these valleys, notably the 1830 Chipursan Valley mud flow and glacier movement, the 1853 Sarat Valley landslide, and 1905 and 1960 Shamshal floods triggered evacuation and abandonment, but habitation persisted as people returned and resettled in their lands. But this sort of pattern has considerably changed in current times, as people are being resettled on new lands with new sorts of architectural patterns that are being explored for their habitation. So the project is basically asking how can we work with the emerging ecology and change in these mountain landscapes. The challenges that the project is addressing are basically that locally, policy level interventions do not address the impact of climate change and the resultant change in landforms on heritage sites and practices. That the lens of conservation in mountain landscapes are specifically looking at the natural environment, but not the people and their living heritage. There's hardly any attention being paid to how people are practicing their everyday lives and how heritage is entwined in the local landscape. And then there is no framework for identifying or documenting at-risk heritage landscapes in Pakistan, where heritage is practiced, is lived and in the making, and it allows us to move away from the frame of conservation and really think about heritage and its adaptation. To address these challenges, the project developed a fragile heritage framework, which was test run in 3 sites: the Karmang Valley in Baltistan, Yasin Valley in Gizar, and the Kalash Valley in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So the first site is Karmang Valley, which is located in the vicinity of the regional center of Skardu on the banks of Indus River and named after the Kar Palace and Monk forts. So it's basically known as the land of palaces and forts, most of which are in a very dilapidated condition, or most of them have been destroyed. So the material heritage here consists of unique architecture found in the remnants of forts and palaces, as well as vernacular dwellings. The immaterial heritage consists of practices and oral heritage that corresponds with the natural environment and landscape, rapidly changing due to the effects of climate change. The second site is Yasin Valley in Gilgit-Baltistan. It's important as it used to be a strategic location, serving as an ancient and important route between South and Central Asia. It connects with Vakhan Pamir area on the north via Darkut Pass and Babagundi on the east via Chilingi Pass. Surrounded by a network of glaciers which cause frequent flooding, notable material heritage comprises forts and megalithic stone circles, along with vernacular abodes, while the immaterial heritage celebrates spirit beings that reside in glaciers untainted by human presence. The third site is the Kalash Valley, which is significant for its unique cultural landscape. The Kalasha are Dardic Indo-Aryan indigenous people with a rich religious and cultural heritage. It is affected by effects of climate change, specifically erratic rainfall patterns and flooding. Here, the notable material heritage comprises temples and graveyards, while the immaterial heritage depends on the rituals and practices of the Kalasha people, which are very much alive even now. So the fragile heritage framework was basically developed to understand how local communities understand heritage, what do they term as heritage, and what are the risks to their heritage, and how is this risk articulated and understood by local communities. And to do this, we developed a couple of proformas and a couple of exercises that were test run in the field with local communities to understand how they are terming heritage and how is the risk being assessed by themselves. The Fragile Heritage Framework employs interdisciplinary and creative methodologies that allow fragile heritage to be assessed, revisited, and reimagined. It uses oral, textual, visual, and digital techniques for participatory documentation and digitization of at-risk local heritages. And it explores how communities experience change and loss of heritage in multiple ways. So the material loss of vernacular homes, significant places within the landscape, and the immaterial loss of practices of everyday life and engagement with the landscape. So basically, the Fragile Heritage Framework consists of proformas, and these were test run with local researchers on the ground. The idea was to map material vernacular and immaterial heritage through audiovisual stories and photo transects to produce deep maps that are cosmopolitical, giving a varied sense of loss of heritage landscapes, patterns of resilience, and their value in climate crisis. So these maps have been developed with artists and based on the articulation of material and immaterial heritages as described and narrated by local communities. And when you see these maps, you see both material and immaterial heritage side by side, and the stories that are associated with these. These have been showcased in the form of a website, which I'll also share at the end of this presentation. Alongside this, we conducted focus group discussions in these valleys that helped us better understand what the community identifies as risk to cultural heritage and their anticipation and propositions for preparedness and cultural heritage adaptation. So some of the findings from the field work, which was conducted over the period of 8 to 9 months last year, we found out that with regards to the material heritage, settlements get displaced due to flooding or slope instability, which is affecting the architectural pattern language of mountain communities. Slope stability is leading local people to resort to RCC foundations in new constructions, and new constructions are done in new materials that are not suitable for the climate and terrain of mountain areas, resulting in warmer indoor climate in summers and colder indoor climate in winters. Certain heritage building and private ownership are endangered due to floods and slope instability, which require considerable funding for their protection and a renovation, which is not possible for a private owner to carry out. In terms of the immaterial heritage, pastoral activities are seen as adversely affected by the impacts of climate change. Because the meadows are washed away by erosion and floods, late winter snow doesn't get absorbed in the pastures, leading to less fertility and the pastures drying up, as narrated by local farmers. Alongside this, musical tunes specifically connected to the movement of animals to pasture lands are diminishing. Shorter and less intense winter means lesser indoor related activities that were key in the preservation and narration of oral heritage. Local and dry winter are not considered good for the reproduction and health of goats, as narrated by one of the local farmers. And the goats are considered an important animal specifically for the Kalasha religion. Decrease in pastoral activities has led to lesser number of livestock, hence less wool and fur, which is compounded by shorter duration of winter season, which has resulted in steep decline in the production of wool products, which used to be an important pastime for local women during the winter season, as they produced crafts or materials out of these goods. The communities feel a deep loss about their way of life, whilst they continue to hang on to sites that are of spiritual importance to them. Their everyday practices of subsistence that are entwined in the local mountain environment are profoundly affected, and the local government needs to step in and support these communities in maintaining their lives and livelihoods. This is something that we noticed in the work that we carried out in this project. Alongside this, the fragile heritage framework that we have developed, we have test run it in these 3 different sites. The framework itself has undergone some changes and some retrofitting according to the questions and the concerns that were raised by local communities. And this framework was then developed as a training exercise for local stakeholders in the mountain areas, and around 35 different professionals were trained in carrying out the fragile heritage framework, which will allow local communities to document and assess risk to their heritage sites themselves without having to always rely on an external expert to come in and do this work for them. So this is basically what the project has been intending to do. We are still in the process of developing our cosmopolitical maps, and I'll share the website in the link to this talk. Thank you very much.